Professor Griffel, thank you so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Nasser, for inviting me.
Of course. So, Professor, I know you've written two very interesting books. Your first book sort of deals with Al-Ghazali's career and examines each stage in Al-Ghazali's career. And I know you have a new book which came out this year, The Formation of Post-Classical Philosophy, where I believe you examine the 12th century Islamic classical philosophy and go deeper into that. I want our conversation to essentially try to examine the state of Islamic philosophy around and before Al-Ghazali's time, and sort of examine Al-Ghazali's introduction in that philosophical era. And then sort of gauge the influence that he might have had and move past towards other figures that might have also come along and played a pivotal role in shaping classical Islamic philosophy. So perhaps we can start off there. How do you see the state and how do you understand Islamic philosophy existing before Al-Ghazali, if you had to explain it to one?
Right. Well, thanks very much for having me on this forum. The only thing I want to say in this, when you say the book on Al-Ghazali was my first book, it was actually already my second book. I had a very, very first book in German on basically the question of takfir, which actually got me to Al-Ghazali because a very central element of the history of takfir in Islam is the last page of his book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, but we might come to that. So I think having myself just written this book on the formation of post-classical philosophy, which is basically the history of philosophy in Islam after Al-Ghazali, the history of Islam before, philosophy in Islam before Al-Ghazali is, in my estimation, very easily told. It is, of course, an effect of the translation movement of Greek into Arabic, which began after the Abbasid Revolution, 750. There are several interesting explanations about why Arabs became interested in Greek philosophy or Greek sciences and overall. Dimitri Gutas has written a very interesting monograph about it. Josh Saliba has also given interesting explanations. But basically from 850, 900 on, we have the whole corpus of, or much of the corpus of Greek philosophical literature translated into Arabic, and that triggers its own philosophical inquiries already in the generation of those who work together with the translators, such as Al-Kindi, and then later other philosophers, the Baghdad Peripatetics, Al-Farabi, and of course, when we look into the period before Al-Ghazali, the major figure is Ibn Sina, of course, who lives around the turn, in this case, to the 5th or the 10th century.
Now, for just any listener who might not necessarily be aware of Ibn Sina, I can sort of also say a few words. A lot of the philosophers you may have mentioned have also sort of lots of contributions in various different areas. I know a lot of these scholars were identified as polymaths, right? So Ibn Sina himself contributed heavily in our understanding of vision, right? Very much wrote about optics and also has written a lot about just the nature of existence and had lots of opinions about religion itself. Is there some specific theme that might have existed in that era during of philosophy that you think would have been interesting to or perhaps let's get into this, right? Let's get into what kind of ideas might have existed before Al-Ghazali that when Al-Ghazali did enter the Islamic philosophy era, what were the points that were of interest specifically to him? I know he was quite against Ibn Sina as well, so perhaps we could also kind of go into that.
Well, I think there was a distinct challenge here, and that was with Avicenna's or Ibn Sina's understanding of what philosophy was in the first place. And here he very much followed an earlier thinker, Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi, who thought about what is actually philosophy as opposed to any other kind of science or any other kind of knowledge. And of course, we can talk also about theology. We can talk about hadith science. We can talk about tafsir, all these different things. And Al-Farabi here followed a particular thought that Aristotle had already expressed by basically saying, well, philosophy is that kind of knowledge which is the kind of most certain knowledge. It's based on arguments that Aristotle and also Al-Farabi thought in this case were really necessary, in a way that if you have reason, as every human is endowed with, and you hear these arguments, then you cannot but agree with them. So there is a certain idea which in Greek has been expressed as so-called apodeixis, which then in Arabic becomes burhan, means in this case, if you agree with the conclusion, with the premises of an argument, you put these premises in a certain order, then comes a conclusion, then you must also agree with the conclusion. Now that, and Al-Farabi then said, philosophy is that kind of knowledge that follows this method. And hence, Al-Farabi also said, it's superior to all other traditions of knowledge. Now that, and Avicenna agreed with that. And whenever Avicenna looked into the subject, be it, for instance, you mentioned some, and we should also say in this is very important, is medicine, where he also made important contributions. Then he always tried to reach this kind of level of knowledge that we call burhani, in the sense that it's knowledge that is indubitable, that every human, by virtue of being endowed with reason, has to agree with. Now that puts a certain challenge, particular to the theologians, by saying in this case, Avicenna implicitly said, well, you theologians, you just do theology. Your premises are not something that are certain. Sorry. But your premises you accept from revelation. We philosophers, we do knowledge, we produce knowledge that can be accepted by everybody. You theologians, you produce knowledge that can only be accepted by Muslims. So that is a challenge that is out there against theologians, and Al-Ghazali took up this challenge. And if I may say how he actually understood it and how he responded, basically said in this, well, so you say that the arguments that you produce, everybody must follow who's endowed with reason. Now let me put myself into that position. So he kind of left the theologian aside, and he says, let me just be a person who is endowed with reason and see whether I have to agree to the conclusions of your arguments. And out of that endeavor comes the Tahafut al-Falasifa, where he actually says, I look into this argument and I find that the premises are not certain, that it's actually used in a way, in this case, that the conclusions are also not certain. So he looks into this certain claim that comes from Al-Farabi and Avicenna and says, actually, it's true in certain fields, like it's true in mathematics. It may also be true in much of the natural sciences, but particularly when we look at so-called metaphysics, meaning in this case, the field that produces, for instance, knowledge about God, then Al-Ghazali said, the arguments that you produce there are not burhani. They are not what you claim they are. In fact, you can poke holes into these arguments at every corner, and that makes your whole idea, that challenges the whole idea of what philosophy is. It's a very fundamental criticism that Al-Ghazali then turns against Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi specifically.
So I would love to sort of step into an introduction of Al-Ghazali, but right before we do that, even when Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi in their arguments, so they identify metaphysical knowledge, if I understand correctly, metaphysical knowledge as coming from burhani, right, which is knowledge that we're all capable of because we all have reason. And right. The other side is saying that, no, this kind of knowledge can only come from theology, right? Not from burhani. And so, I mean, the existing philosophers, Avicenna and Al-Farabi, was their thought process And if so, how much of it was influenced by just the Quran and just the Islamic teachings as they were? Because I'd be very curious to know how they might have battled that.
Yeah, good question. And of course, now, first, one should say in this case, there's a famous book out there by my colleague, Dimitri Gutas, Avicenna and the Aristotelian tradition. And it's right. And Dimitri Gutas stresses in this case that there is a strong connection between Avicenna and Aristotle. He saw himself more or less as the second Aristotle. In a sense, you would say, whereas the first Aristotle, explained everything that was known, in this case, you might say, to the Greek culture, Avicenna saw himself as the person, who explains everything in Islamic and also Arabic culture, but also Islamic, because he, for instance, looked into the phenomenon of prophecy. So the first Aristotle, the real Aristotle, so to speak, he did not have any opinion in this case about prophecy, because it wasn't something in this case that was particularly prominent in his culture. In fact, for him in this case, for Aristotle, for the real Aristotle, prophecy was quackery. Now, when Avicenna picks this up, Ibn Sina picks up the question of prophecy. He first says in this case, prophecy exists. It's a fact. And if it is a fact, then it must have natural causes. It must have causes that can be explained, just like any other fact of nature, so to speak. So he says in this case, prophecy is not something supernatural. Prophecy is something that can be reasonably explained, and then he sits down and explains this reasonably. And so he goes about with numerous phenomena that we would call phenomena of religion. So for instance, prophecy is one example. Walaya, what we actually call, the wali, the friends of God, God's intimates. That is also a question in this case that Ibn Sina actually tackles. And here, the same way, he gives a reasonable explanation. He says in this case, it's not something supernatural. Even so far as magic, he would say in this case, it's not something supernatural. What appears to us as natural can be all explained, not in a way that you would say in this case, magic must be some kind of trickery. It doesn't say that. No, these are powers that humans are endowed with, that are real powers. So these are explanations that we must say in this case follow the science of the day, which is a little bit different from our science. But what the goal of Ibn Sina's philosophical system was to give scientific explanations for basically all the things that Avicenna thought exists in the world. And among those things that exist for Avicenna were definitely prophecy, walaya, mu'jizat, karamat, all these things that we now would call in this case phenomena of revealed religion that Avicenna acknowledged exist and that he explained philosophically.